Today's topic is economic compulsion and the critique of suffering. And as you can see, I'm sitting behind the desk. Yesterday I didn't have one, I was standing up. And that has to do with the fact that I'm not so familiar with this topic. So I rather sit protected by the desk and more or less hopefully reading my talk. The talk itself was intended as a short summary of my book, A Critical Theory of Economic Compulsion. It was quite difficult to narrow it down to, I don't know, 3,000 words or so. And when I got to these 3,000 words, all I had was citations and quotations, which is a bit strange for a talk, just to talk quotations all the time. So I beefed it up again. So there are some of my own words here. But I will not say quote. I will just talk as if it's mine. If you recognize it, that's great. If not, then credit these great ideas to myself, which would of course be a plagiarism, but there we are. The quotations are mainly from Marx and from Adorno. And it's a little bit of a dialogue between Marx and Adorno. Marx is the person of economic compulsion, and Adorno is the person of suffering, at least as far as my talk is concerned, critical theory of suffering. And my book starts with the following quotation from Adorno. It's from his lectures that he gave in 1964, and the book is called History and Freedom, or Freedom and History, something like that. But it's these three words. I'm not sure whether freedom comes first or history comes first. And the quotation is this: given the current state of technical development, the fact that there are still countless millions who suffer hunger and want must be attributed, he argues, to the forms of social reproduction, the relations of production, not to the intrinsic difficulties or difficulty of meeting people's material needs. That was in 1964. Millions of people. I don't know. We have to ask Piketty how many of these millions have now, as it were, become bigger in number. But for Adorno, it's not a matter of technical difficulty, of public policy, of the sort of right party winning the elections and then having the power of government under his fingernails and organizing government on behalf of these millions who suffer from hunger, who can't buy the food they need, who can't buy the clothes they need, who can't pay their electricity bills, and are really struggling to make ends meet, who are struggling for wage-based employment, because the alternative to wage-based employment are dire. As I mentioned in the lecture yesterday, if you can't sell your labor power, what can you sell? What is left? And this condition, he argues, this condition of suffering, it's not a consequence of class or hard-nosed class politics. It's not a technical difficulty. It's not a question of the right party winning an election and enacting a certain public policy in support of those who suffer. It has to do, he says, with the social relations of production. So it is them that need to be changed. For the suffering and the struggle against suffering, or what Marx called the class struggle, which is a struggle to make ends meet, for that to stop. That's the preamble. That's the quotation with which my book starts. A colleague of mine called Charlotte Baumann, she says that Marx's critique of political economy is concerned with the systematic, what she calls conceptualization or systematic critique of capital. On the other hand, she says, and she argues, that for Adorno, what is central to his concerns is human suffering and the struggle for self-preservation in class society. So I'm not sure whether she's right, that Marx is the logician, as it were, of the concept of capital, and whether suffering, the struggle for self-preservation, is central to Adorno's negative dialectics. I don't know. And I don't want to dig into that. What I'm concerned about is this. I want to look at Marx's conception of what his critique of political economy is about. He says it's a critique of the entire system of economic categories. That's how he conceives of his critique of political economy, as the critique of the entire system of economic categories. And I want to check out what that might mean through the lens of Bauman's understanding of Adorno's critical theory, as a critical theory of suffering, as a critical theory of self-preservation. And the term economic compulsion is very helpful in this regard, I think, because it refers the force, the power of economic compulsion back to the individuals, to the social individuals, to those who are compelled. If the economy is a compelling force that forces people to adapt to market pressure, market development, to economic requirements, then it forces human beings to do something. So the term economic compulsion refers the economic categories back to the social individuals who struggle to prevent themselves from going under, who struggle to avert suffering, I argue, gives the world, or gives their own social world, an independent power, the independent power of compulsion. The next paragraph tells you, or should have told you, what's going to happen in my paper, what I will do first and second, but on reading it, I got it completely wrong. I said that I will be looking at the meaning of economic compulsion for heterodox Marxist tradition. And when I was reading it through, I'm not doing anything of the kind. What I'm doing in the first step is to look methodologically, what does critique mean? The critique of political economy. And it starts like this. Alternative terms for economic compulsion are system logic or real economic abstraction or exchange abstraction, or what Marx refers to as capital as an abstraction in action. That was Marx calls capital, an abstraction in action. And he depicts capital as an abstraction in action, as a process of self-valorizing value, as a process of valorization, which proceeds, as it were, and unfolds independently from the acting subjects, and it, as it were, asserts itself over the social individuals, I quote from Marx, with the force of an elementary natural process. And we discussed it yesterday for those who were there by looking at money making, valorization. So all too often these terms, system logic, exchange abstraction, real economic abstraction, valorization, capital, all these terms are in traditional Marxist discourse, often at least understood in abstraction from the social practices of the society to which they belong, and from which these terms achieve or derive their validity. And the obvious example in this respect is Marxian economics, which doesn't involve itself in a critique of the entire system of economic categories, but seeks to formulate an alternative economic theory, which is represented in my paper here, this tradition by Harvey, David Harvey. I'll come to it briefly in a second or two. And the other obvious example is the structuralist Marxist tradition associated with the work of Althusser and also Poulantzas. Structuralist Marxism understands the critique of political economy as a science of economic matter in abstraction from the wounded subjects that make up society. It holds that the scientific approach must proceed, quote, without ulterior metaphysical thoughts. And that is, it must exclude the human and social content of the economic abstractions from consideration. In order to gain, the approach argues, scientific knowledge about the decisive character of the economic categories. So the approach is based on the idea that every economic form, including the value form of capitalist political economy, quote, can be reduced to a natural process. And that quotation is from David Harvey, which makes sense. If you're a Marxian economist, then the idea of economy excludes the notion that the economic categories are socially constituted. Instead, it demands that the economic categories are transhistorical, and as such, a Marxist economist, you will, as it were, organize them in a different mode of production for different ends. That makes sense. Otherwise, Marxian economics would be a contradiction in terms. The only way to resolve it was to transnationalize or transhistorialize, if that's the right word to use, capitalist economic categories. So both Marxian economics and the structuralist Marxist tradition consider the capitalist economic categories as the historically overdetermined forms of general economic laws, which are founded, in its view, on nature. They have a natural basis. Unsurprisingly, therefore, it views the critique of political economy as a discourse without a subject, that is Althusser, and is argued by Althusser and also Poulantzas, the critique of political economy must reduce the philosophical myth of man, man with a capital M, der Mensch, die Menschheit, das Menschlein, everybody. It must reduce the philosophical idea of man to ashes, to nothing. It must burn it, to prove itself as a veritable science of economic matter. So it's a critique of capitalist society that articulates the suffering it causes and whose purpose it is to express suffering in theoretical terms, is rejected as counterproductive to the scientific task of identifying the objective laws of historical development in their historically overdetermined mode of existence. So I don't want to go into the tiresome debate about the so-called early humanist Marx and then the later, much wiser, mature, late scientific Marx. Needless to say, with reference to Adorno, or as Adorno put it, dialectical historical materialism, which is the interpretation of Marx's critique of political economy as a science of economic nature, is, I quote, a perversion of Marxian motives. It rejects, he argues, this scientific Marxism. It rejects as unscientific the notion that reality, our social reality, the reality in which we live, is not independent of the social relations. It is true, our reality incorporates individuals, us, as personifications or character masks. Nevertheless, capitalist economic objectivity, its shape remains human. However reified and naturalized capitalist society appears in its economic, or in its reified economic form. The mythological idea of fate is no less mythical when it is demythologized, sorry, it's a difficult word for me to pronounce, into a secular logic of things. Who or that, akin to an objectively unfolding system logic, structures the economic behaviors of actual individuals by means of competing price signals. The critique of political economy either rejects the scientific doctrine of invariance, as Adorno speaking, and aims at the thing itself from within its own context to grasp its social nature, or it does not. The former, the critique of economic categories from within their own context, or the critique of economic nature as a social nature, turns the critique of political economy into a critical social theory, whereas the latter turns the critique of political economy into a traditional social theory, which does not, as it were, think in and through its concepts, but above about its concepts. So it thinks about its concepts, and which naturalizes the capitalist economic categories as historically overdetermined specifications of general economic laws. So critically conceived, historical materialism is a critique of the dogmatic, or a critique of the naturalized appearance of society. It is critique of the dogmatic appearance of society as natural in its essence. What appears in the appearance of society is not economic nature, as argued by Harvey, Althusser, Polanski. What appears in the appearance of society is, in fact, man, with a capital M, in her historically specific social relations. Alfred Schmidt, student of Adorno's, understanding of the critique of political economy as amounting to a conceptualized social practice succinctly expresses this insight. And I will now look into this further. So how does Marx himself conceive his historical materialism? There is not much to be found in Marx, but this sentence, I think, captures it nevertheless. It is historical materialism, he argues, in reality much easier to discover by analysis the earthly kernel of the mystic creation of religion, or, in different words, it is in reality very easy to discover by analysis the natural foundation of the given relations of life, then to do the opposite, to develop from the actual given relations of life the forms in which they have become naturalized. The latter method, he says, is the only materialist one. And he says the former method, the method that looks at economic nature, or that assumes and presumes economic nature, and then tells the story of its historical unfolding, from the hunters to the gatherers to agriculture, to capitalist society, and then to socialism and communism. He calls that an abstract materialism that excludes the notion of history. There's no sense, no understanding of history. So Marx's historical materialism is charged with deciphering the natural appearance of society as a socially constituted nature. It is demystification, as it were, of natural objectivity, of the natural objectivity of capitalist society. In support of this, he argues in a series of surplus value. He argues every social form, even the simplest form, such as the commodity, is already an inversion and makes the relations between people appear as attributes of things. So, the immediacy of the economic world is not really an immediacy of economic nature. Rather, the immediacy of things are the forms of appearance of essential relations. That is, quote again from Adorno, essence, that what makes life essential, passes into that which lies concealed beneath the facades of immediacy, of the supposed facts. And this essence which lies concealed makes the facts what they are. So what is mediated in the immediacy of the social forms, or the immediacy of the economic object, or in the immediacy of monetary quantities, are the social practices of historically determined social relations. On the one hand, with reference to the social individuals, their struggle for self-preservation takes place in conditions over which they have no control, and which might just as well reward them for their efforts in the form of wage income, or cut them off from the means of production or means of subsistence, without prior notice. On the other, their struggle for self-preservation endows society with an independent economic will that, quote, asserts itself as a regulative law of nature. So, society as object and society as subject are the same and not the same. To illustrate this point, and with reference to yesterday's lecture, nobody eats money. But without money, nobody eats. Money is the universal form of capitalist wealth. It creates society in the form of the money subject. Money speaks. Money condemns. Money rules. And society in the form of the money subject waits on the individual until it splinters, until it fractures, until it obeys, until it works for money, which is the only way of making a living. Yet, what is money? Does money care for the sacrifice of living labor on the altar of money? Does money care whether it deflates or inflates? Does money care whether it's desired by the many and the few? Does money care if people struggle for money? Money is really just, when you look down at it into its nature, a piece of metal, a piece of paper. What gives money its power are the social relations of production. The capitalist must care for money. Without profit, that is, money making money out of money, he might go out, he might be liquidated, his capital might go into bankruptcy. So the capitalist speaks through money in the language of profit, in the language of money making, in the language of interest. And the worker too cares for money. They struggle for money, they struggle for wages to make a living, and their struggle also speaks through money. And in fact, the social reproduction of the worker depends on the profitability of their living labor, as I explained yesterday. Unprofitable employers of labor power shed labor. Profitable employers purchase labor power. The profitability of the expended living labor is primary. The satisfaction of human needs is a mere sideshow. Only as a surplus value producer is the free laborer respectable. Otherwise, he or she is just an economic zero, redundant, superfluous. The profit motive, I'm quoting from Adorno, which divides society and potentially tears it apart, is also the factor by which society reproduces its own existence. Wages are a function of exploitation. Profit is the condition of wage income. For Adorno, it seems to me, self-preservation, the struggle to avert suffering, is the non-conceptual content of the economic concept of society. The economic concept of society is what? Economic growth. Rates of profit, rates of accumulation, quantities of money, prices, cash, income. But the non-conceptual content is meant the social practices, the social experiences, the struggle for self-preservation, which makes these economic categories, or which gives these economic categories of profit, cash, of price, of income, a power of compulsion. Without the struggle for self-preservation, there would be no valid economic capitalism, economic categories. As a process of valorization, capital is not only indifferent to the social individuals, since profit is primary, the satisfaction of need, a mere sideshow. It is also, a quote, hostile to them. Their life depends on our life, the life of our society, depends on the processes and requirements of valorization. Time is money, and money is time. Capitalist wealth exists in the form of money as more money. Money rules. What matters is the exchangeability of the labor products for money, which transforms them into commodities. The satisfaction of human needs does not validate the expended labor. Rather, the expended labor, its validation, occurs in the form of money. Money, not the satisfaction of wants, is the form of social value. What cannot be exchanged for money is, socially speaking, valueless, as is the living labor expended on the production of failed commodities. Instead of valorizing the invested capital, that capital is devalued. What matters, therefore, is exchangeability of money for more money. The resolution of an equivalent exchange between unequal values, that is, the exchange of money for more money, lies in the concept of surplus value, which is the difference between the value of labor power and the total value produced by labor during the length of the working day. Only because the worker, argues Adorno, has nothing else but his labor power does he accept these conditions. Behind this strange exchange of money for more money lies the question of class relations. The freedom, or he says, the secret of the freedom of labor is the freedom to starve, or as Adorno or Marx put it, the lash of hunger compels them to sell their services for the profit of another class of men. And this lash of hunger is, as it were, a corporeal experience, a bodily experience, a psychological, emotional experience. And this experience is ingrained into the collective consciousness of society from head to toe. On the one hand, we have the language of the market, the language of factor efficiency, rates of profit, rates of accumulation, price, interest rates, income. On the other, we have the language of need, quote, proletarian language is dictated by hunger, end of quote. So now to the second part. It's about reification and social suffering. Unlike Adorno, Marx does not argue that reification or the fetishism of commodities in the case of Marx is, quote, an epiphenomenon, something that is not really central. For Marx, the question is, what is necessary? What is unavoidable with a given production system? End of quote. His critique of the fetishism of the commodities does not deny its reality. According to his argument, historically definite social relations assume the form of a relationship between things, and the social individuals are governed by the products of their own hand. That is, they are really governed by the price mechanism, by the movement of economic quantities. Their existence is really regulated by the invisible hand, by rates of profit and accumulation, and they are thus governed by the necessity to transform their labor time into money time. Their product really has to be money. Exchange equivalent, as I explained yesterday, is exchange between equivalent amounts of socially necessary labor time. The difference between this expenditure of concrete labor and that expenditure of concrete labor is a difference of quantity in the reward of money that accrues to them in exchange. What is real, therefore, is the compulsion to achieve on a permanent basis a revolution in value, by which each capitalist seeks at least to maintain his market share through the increase in labor productivity, to avoid competitive erosion, devaluation. What is real, therefore, is the law of equivalence, which, as Horkheimer and Adorno put it at the start of their dialectics of enlightenment, the law of equivalence makes the dissimilar comparable by reducing it to abstract quantities. That which does not reduce to a number and ultimately to the one becomes illusion. The illusion of capitalism, or the illusion of the capital social relations, is the Enlightenment idea of humanity as an end in itself, life without fear. Or the pain of ruin in capitalist society. Living labor either produces money, which maintains the free laborer as a needy individual who produces wealth for other people, or it produced nothing at all, which makes them dependent on the charity of others for their social reproduction. I want to explain briefly the idea of Adorno, that the law of equivalence makes the dissimilar comparable by reducing it to abstract quantities. You might remember, at least also read yesterday, that I argued that in Marx, the exchange relationship, concrete labor produces shoes, shirts, rings, glasses, a hat, and down here we have bread. Yeah. But they have to assume the form of money, which reduces these concrete things to quantities of 50 euros, 20 euros, 100 euros, 175. And the bread maker, unfortunately, went bankrupt because he didn't get any money for his expended labor for his bread. What counts is not this. What counts is the transformation of that into commensurable and comparable quantities. What counts is the 50 euros, the 100 euros, the 75 euros. Yeah. That which cannot be transformed into quantity is nothing. It's no use value at all. It's a failed commodity that is burned and led to rot because it does not achieve the attribution that it has to be achieved, that it has to achieve the attribution of money, and there is the attribution of a certain quantity of money. Yeah, that's why I argued earlier in my paper. The social validation of capitalist production is not the satisfaction of human needs, which is the human need for shoes, for a shirt, for a ring, for glasses, for a hat, for bread, rather in capitalism. social validation of the expended labor is achieved in terms of comparable quantities of currencies. Notes. Yeah, so far okay? So that which doesn't reduce to a number is nothing, argues Marx and argues Adorno. So the worker really has to produce money in exchange, to maintain him or herself as a needy individual that produces wealth in the form of money for other people. And if the expended labor does not produce money, then they have not produced anything at all. Neither bread nor shoes. They have produced failed commodities. Their labor is therefore redundant. And the macroeconomic calculation of the unemployed as economic zeros is not untrue. It makes clear that the life of the sellers of labor power really hangs by the profitable extraction of surplus value from their living labor. Indeed, argues Adorno, as mere character marks, agents of exchange in a supposedly separate economic order, they owe their life to what is being done to them. Society, he argues, stays alive, not despite its antagonism, but by means of it. What counts is the profitable valorization of living labor. There is no profit in things that cannot be traded for money. In its inverted form, as a process of economic abstraction, society is not perceptible, except where it hurts. Money talks. Those without money chew words to fill their bellies. So Adorno's characterization of reification as an epiphenomenon does not deny the reality of reified society either. However, he is concerned with its concealed social content that both belongs to and is more than the reified economic object. Like Marx, his conception of capitalist society as an objective illusion, Adorno holds that the natural character of capitalist society is both an actuality and, at the same time, a necessary illusion. The illusion signifies that within this society, laws can only be implemented as natural processes over people's head. In other words, as economic compulsion. Whilst their validity arises from the form of the relations of production within which production takes place. So, on the one hand, the relations of economic objectivity. They assert the economic laws as forces, quote, external to man, and as forces on which the life of all men hangs by to the vanishing point in death of all. On the other, the true content of the economic forms. It lies in the human experiences and the human practices contained in them. Only by deciphering this content do these forms become comprehensible. So the reality in which the social individual exists has no invariant character. That is something which exists independently from it. So in Adorno, you will not find a theory of reification. Adorno's critical theory digs into the concept of reified society to decipher, to bring to the fore what is active within it. So instead of thinking about reified society, his critical theory aims to think in and through it, quote, in order to destroy its immediacy, which means dissolving the appearance of naturalness through the critical process. Marx, argues Adorno, assigns to the reflective mind the task of dispelling this illusion of naturalness, and in contrast of uncovering what lies concealed. So Adorno's characterization of reification as an epiphenomenon highlights crucial insights in Marx's critique of capital that are generally ignored in traditional Marxism. Adorno does not ask, what is reification? He does not say, how do we best identify and define reification? Like Marx, Marx does not say, how do we identify capital? How do we define capital? Instead, Adorno and Marx, to a lesser extent, I guess, Adorno asks, what does reification mean for people? What does it do to people? And what do the people do when they do what they need to do to make ends meet? It is their social practice which endows the reified world with a will and a consciousness and a language of business. So just like the fetishism of commodities does not refer to the fetishized object, reification does not refer to the reified object either. It refers to reified, or in the case of Marx, fetishized social relations. Reified society cannot exist without distorting man, who, driven mad as personifications of their own social world, accumulate capital for the sake of accumulation, or make money for the sake of making money. They exploit living labor for the sake of exploitation in order to prevent themselves from going under. That's the capitalist. And the worker? They struggle to make a living in economic bondage as exploited human material. Reification, or reified society, as economic process, quote, finds its limitation in reified man. What then is reified? What then does it do to people? And what, in fact, appears in reification? So I leave the rest out to come to my conclusion, which is in 4 short paragraphs, and then I have a proscript, which I added is a consequence of my experience at a recent Adorno conference. The prejudice against the human struggle against suffering as a supposedly metaphysical distraction to scientific analysis confirms as a principle of thought what is in great measure a socially necessary illusion. The assumption that the economic categories are natural in character is not untrue. But this truth is their own untruth. The elementary, seemingly natural economic process that occurs behind the backs of the acting subjects is their own work, their own product, their own, or the product of their own practice. In this respect, the scientific prejudice about man, her wounds, her hurt, and her needs, is the expression of a society that is unaware of itself. I argued, and I quote here Moshe Poston, that Marx's critique transforms the categories of political economy from trans-historical categories of the constitution of wealth into critical categories of the specificity of the forms of wealth in social relations in capitalism. The mysterious character of a reified world in which an invisible hand regulates the movement of economic quantities, in which the socially valid product of living labor is money, in which money is accumulated for the sake of more money, and in which the market speaks to its agents through competitive price movements. All of that and more finds its rational solution in human praxis and in the comprehension of that praxis, however mad this praxis might be, in the movement of the money subject. The preponderance of society as a reified object contains the sheer unrest of life as its hidden secret. The social premise is the free laborer as a needy surplus value producer. The truth content of the economic forms is the social experience, the human practice, the hurt and suffering locked within them. The need, and now I'm quoting Adorno at length, the need to make suffering speak, to lend a voice to suffering, is a condition of all truth. In this context, suffering is not an existential term of pure subjective feeling. Rather, it is an objectively mediated term. It is the weight of objectivity, the weight of society as a reified economic object, the weight of society as a process of self-valorizing value. It is the weight of this objectivity upon the acting subject. And because that which the subject experiences at its most subjective moment, the moment of suffering, of hurt, because of this suffering is objectively mediated. So, a definite social logic holds sway in the economic forms. Money has to be made. If money is not made, social catastrophe unfolds. However, as a critical social theory, The critique of political economy does not think about reified things, nor is it satisfied with identifying their power of compulsion. Rather, it thinks out of these things, to understand, to comprehend, to grasp what is active within it. And what's active within them are the social struggles to prevent themselves, the social individuals, to go under. What is active within them is the social struggle to avert suffering. What is active within them is the struggle also against the condition or conditions that cause suffering. In other words, there is no class struggle as an idea, as of something, of an historical subject. Class struggle does not happen because people believe in socialism. The class struggle is a struggle against the conditions that cause suffering. Adorno's negative dialectics of the inverted society in the form of the economic object, and Marx's decipherment of economic abstractions as the forms of definite social relations are cut from the same cloth. More clearly than Marx, I would argue, whose critique, Marx's critique, remains conceptually wedded to the promises of the Enlightenment. Adorno recognizes human suffering and the struggle to avert it as the concealed content of the inverted society that is under the compulsion of economic necessity. He conceives of this struggle against suffering as the active social force of the dialectic of the forces and relations of production. There is no historical subject. History has no telos. The struggle that will end capitalism, when capitalism will end, as all things end at some point, the struggle that ends capitalism might not usher in communism. The struggle to avert suffering might lead to new forms of repression in reified society. It might unleash also unbridled forms of barbarism. It might also, even if only briefly, until the protest against suffering is starved back to work, crack open the thin crust of reified society and let the light in. Only in these glimpses, argues Adorno, do we find traces of hope, of ever coming across genuine and just reality. Now, the postscript. So I wrote the postscript as a consequence of my experience at the recent Adorno gathering, where everybody talked about normative orders. The great word, everything ought to be better, happier, different. And who would object to that? Things really ought to be different. So in my postscript I say, every victory for the political economy of labor over the political economy of capital is to be welcomed. Civilized domination and humane exploitation are preferable to authoritarian or barbaric government and unfettered forms of surplus value extraction. However, efforts at humanizing are based on the premise of inhuman conditions. To claim otherwise, and to claim that the ought can just be, as it were, produced in reality, seems to be morally superior to the objective reason of critique. And the objective reason of critique is to say that the effort at humanization of conditions is premised on inhuman conditions. It's them that need to be changed. So what really is the is that ought to be better? The critique of class society finds its positive resolution only in a classless society, not in a fairer class society. That's it. Thank you very much.